Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we are going to do a comparison between the three Odin 2 devices that we have on the market today. Each of these handhelds I would consider to be a premium Android-based device. They all have the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor inside, so it really comes down to just the matter of size and other features. And you'd think it's a pretty easy choice between them. I mean, obviously just get the one that fits the size that you want, but it's not that easy because each of them have their own unique factors to them, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and so that's what we're going to focus on in this video. So if you're on the fence about one of these three models, I'm hoping this video will put you on the right track. Without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. So let's start by talking about what is the Odin 2 and why it should matter. And so number one, this is the original Odin 2 right here. It came out about a year and a half ago at this point. And like I mentioned, it is an Android-based handheld system. So essentially you just install all of your apps and then use, a fancy front end to wrap it all together, much like other emulation-based handhelds. What really sets this one apart is that it has the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor inside, which at the time of making this handheld was one of the best processors on the market. To top it off, it also had a competitive price point for what you were getting. It started at $300 retail compared to phones at the time, which had the same chipset, usually going around $500 or $600. So at the time, this was like the #1 premier handheld, and definitely one of my favorites that have come out over the past year and a half. Now, about a year ago, they came out with this little guy. This is the Odin 2 Mini, so same processor here, but it is in a much smaller form factor. Now, in addition to the size of the device, the screen size was also different. This is a 6-inch LCD, whereas this one is a 5-inch mini LED. And this one was also a little bit more expensive. It started at $340 retail. So essentially, the Odin 2 Mini is a smaller version of the original Odin 2. Now, a few months ago, we got the third Odin 2 device. This one here is called the Odin 2 Portal. This one is kind of like a bigger brother to the other two. This one has a 7-inch OLED panel that has a 120 Hz refresh rate. It also has a couple other premium features like an all-glass display. You can see that it just kind of goes across the entire thing. In general, it's also a larger handheld, which makes it more comfortable for bigger hands and also excellent for doing things like game streaming. And as you can imagine, with these additional features like this new screen, it does have a higher price than the original Odin 2, but not as high as the Odin 2 Mini. This one starts at retail $330 before shipping. So these are the three players that we have in this video today. We've got the original Odin 2, the Odin 2 Mini, and then the Odin 2 Portal. And like I said, I would consider these to be premium Android handhelds. For the most part, these have so much power that you can do anything that you can do on Android. The limitation is really the operating system itself. For example, you can emulate things like Nintendo Switch and Wii U and whatnot, but it really depends on the emulator and its compatibility and how far the development has come, and then also just whether or not there's an emulator there in the first place. Now, it's also worth noting that there are other alternatives to the Odin 2 within the Android space, and I think that for cheaper devices, these three might be worth considering. We have the Retroid Pocket 5, the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, which is essentially the same thing but in a clamshell form factor, and then also the Anbernic RG557. Each of these devices are around $250, but are not quite as powerful as the Odin 2, but they might be good enough for your price range as well as just the performance that you're looking for. Now, on the higher end of the spectrum, we have some other options as well. On the Android side, we have stuff like the AYN Pocket Evo, which has a similar chipset to the Odin 2 devices, but is a little bit more expensive. And I did a full comparison video between this and the Odin 2 Portal. I'll leave it linked down below if you want to dig a little bit further. It's also worth noting that some of these Android-based handhelds start reaching up into that price point of the Steam Deck, and so it's worth considering the Steam Deck as well. When it comes to price to performance, the Steam Deck is going to win every time against something like Android because this is an x86 handheld. It's going to be able to play PC games. You'll be able to play thousands of games on this that you cannot on Android. But of course, a handheld PC has its own set of drawbacks compared to Android, like worse battery life as well as being just heavier in general. So I would say that the target audience of something like an Odin 2 handheld is somebody who wants a little bit more power than something like the Retroid Pocket 5, but then also does not want to deal with the lower battery life or the heavier size and weight of something like the Steam Deck, because this is kind of the middle ground right there. Now, before we do a comparison against all three different models, let's talk about what's the same between them so that we have the same baseline. So right off the bat, number one is the fact that they are running the same chipset, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. They're also running Android 13, and a lot of the specs associated with this chipset are the same. So they all have Wi-Fi 7 as well as Bluetooth 5.3. They also have some similarities in other ways. For example, the feel of the D-pad is pretty similar between the three. They're all kind of like a PS Vita style D-pad. These analog sticks also are relatively the same. They are all Hall sensor and have a nice range of motion to them. And so I really like these analog sticks, and you can change out the caps for them as well. And then finally, all three of these devices have analog triggers, which means that, when you're playing streaming and more modern games, that's going to be great to be able to have that full analog input. Hey, this is Next Day /Editing Russ. One thing I want to add in right here is that all three of the Odin 2 devices can now boot into Linux, including the Rocknix operating system. A couple months ago, I did a video showing how you could get this running on the original Odin 2, but since making that video, they now have support for the Odin 2 Portal as well as the Odin 2 Mini, so all three of these can boot into Linux. And this opens up a whole world of possibilities, including the desktop version of the PS3 emulator, as well as the original Xbox emulator, and other things like Portmaster. In fact, even though these are primarily Android-based devices, they also happen to be the most powerful Linux-based handhelds you can find today. Just yesterday, they released a new stable build of Rocknix, which includes official support for the Odin 2, Odin 2 Portal, and Odin 2 Mini. So just another reason why I love these devices so much, and it works on all three. But there are some unique characteristics for each of them, so let's talk about each of those, starting with the original Odin 2. We're going to talk about both good and bad with each of these handhelds, and we'll start with the good stuff first. And one of my favorite things about the original Odin 2 is that we have a bunch of different color options. I think there are 6 in total. However, bear in mind that with the base model, which is the cheapest model for each of these devices, it's only going to come in the color black. So if you want any of the additional colors, you will have to use either the Pro or Max model, which they offer on their website as well. And like I mentioned, the Odin 2 has a bunch of different color options, and some of these are really great. Now, my personal Odin 2 is a little bit unique. So what I did is I took buttons from other versions of the Odin 2 and then put them inside of my white model. So this one is unique. You're not going to be able to buy one that has like black buttons and colored buttons. It's just going to be all white if you get the white model. But thankfully, you can purchase all of these buttons on your own if you want to customize it yourself. I think that's pretty awesome. Another unique aspect to the original Odin 2 is that in addition to the RGB lighting it has around the analog sticks, which is also found in the Odin 2 Portal, it has this RGB strip on the sides, and I really like this. For example, when playing in a dark environment, it makes a little bit of a glow along the sides of your hands, and I've always really enjoyed that. So that's one of the things I do when I'm playing in the dark, is that I turn off the RGB lights around the sticks, but then I keep them on the sides just because I like that little ambience. It's also worth noting that the ABXY pattern on this device is Nintendo Switch style compared to Xbox style like on the other two. So the A button is going to be on the right. Now, there are some downsides to the Odin 2 as well, and I think first and foremost is the fact that this white color in particular is prone to staining. I don't know if it just has to do with the overall finish on the plastic, but I've seen a lot of people get just little stains right here on the sides of their Odin 2. Now, this has been my primary handheld for like a year and a half at this point. I don't have any staining on mine, but I do put it in a case every time I'm not using it, but that is something to think about, is that some people have gotten a little bit of staining on their white model in particular. Another thing that's unique about the Odin 2 is that the D-pad and right analog stick placement are not super ergonomic. They basically just go straight down from the others. As you'll see on the other two devices, they're a little bit more inset, which makes them just a little bit easier to reach with your thumbs, and unfortunately this is just straight down. So I feel like the D-pad ergonomics in particular are not the most comfortable in the world. I wish it was just a little bit closer to the screen. And then finally, one other thing worth noting is that the Odin 2 among the three devices has the worst input latency, and a lot of people think it has to do with the screen. I did a bunch of testing when I was first trying out the Odin 2 Portal. I'll leave that segment of the video link down below, but essentially yes, we found that the Odin 2 was the slowest among the three. Now, personally, I'm not super susceptible to input latency, so it's never been an issue for me, but there are definitely people who have found it to be a deal breaker, so I wanted to bring that up. If input latency is really important to you, then the Odin 2 is the worst of the bunch. Now, the Odin 2 Mini also has its own unique characteristics, and I think number one is the fact that it is so small. I mean, this thing is like a souped-up version of the PS Vita. In fact, among the three, this is the only one that I would consider to be actually pocketable. It's still a little big, like you actually need to have some pretty big shorts to be able to fit them in. But if you are looking for something that at least is more travel and pocket friendly, then the Odin 2 Mini is definitely your friend in that regard. It's also quite a bit lighter than the others. It's only 320 grams, whereas both of the other two are about 420, 430. Another thing I really like about this handheld is the overall rounded shape of it and the ergonomic feeling of it. It is a flat device, like it doesn't have any ergonomic grips to it, but the roundedness right here makes it really easy to access all of the buttons. And so I found this to be a very comfortable handheld to use in most use cases. devices. And the design here I think is a little bit better than the original Odin 2. You can see that the D-pad and the right analog stick are more inboard, which makes them a little bit easier to access. The major drawback I have for this has to do with the screen. Now we've got a whole screen section later in this video, but I did want to mention, this is a 5-inch screen and it's mini LED. Now 5 inches to me is a little bit small, even though of course the device is small. I feel like 5.5 would have been better. And as I'll demonstrate later in the video, I feel like the color profiles and the overall balance and brightness and whatnot is just a little bit weird with this as well. And then finally, my other drawback, and again, this is going to be its own section later on, is battery life. So this one has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery compared to 8,000 with the other two, and you can definitely see the difference in battery life with this one. Now let's talk about the Odin 2 Portal. There's a lot of good and bad with this one as well. Number one is this screen. So this is a 7-inch AMOLED display, and it also has a 120 Hz refresh rate. I talked about this a lot in my Odin 2 Portal videos, but essentially that allows us to use tools like black frame insertion to give us really nice motion clarity when emulating older systems. In addition, having a 120 Hz refresh rate will reduce input latency, and you can also do game streaming at 120 Hz as well. And so I consider this screen to be a huge upgrade over the other two, both in terms of size as well as colors and also quality. Now I also have a couple drawbacks for it. Number one is going to be the somewhat flat ergonomics, and it does have some ergonomic bumps to it, but they're not very pronounced and definitely lower than on the Odin 2. And with a big device like this, it is definitely something that feels a little bit flat. In addition, the face buttons on this are quite clacky compared to the other two. Again, we'll test this more in detail later on. So to wrap things up, here is a Venn diagram of all three devices and what's similar between them and what is different. In the center, you can see that yes, they all have the same chipset and features when it comes to the chipset parameters, and then they also all have a 1080p resolution. In terms of some shared features, on the left side, you can see the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Mini both have a 60 Hz refresh rate screen, whereas the Odin 2 Portal is 120. In addition, on the right side, you can see the Odin 2 and the Portal both have an 8,000 milliamp hour battery compared to the Mini, which is only 5,000 milliamp hours. And then finally, along the edges of each of these devices, you can see that, they each have different panel types and also different screen sizes, and then, different weights and everything else like that. So in general, yes, there are many things that are similar between the Odin 2 devices, but there are some features that are a little bit unique to each one. Now let's talk about a bunch of different categories and how each of these three handhelds stack up. So things like their screen and ergonomics and buttons, stuff like that. We'll start with ergonomics first, and we'll talk about the Odin 2 Mini and then work our way up to the bigger handhelds. And I think that in terms of ergonomics, the Odin 2 Mini is actually surprisingly good. Like I mentioned before, it's more rounded along the edges, and so it's very easy to be able to shift your hand down to be able to reach any of the controls. In particular, I found this to be surprisingly good when it comes to D-pad centric gaming. It's one of my favorite little handhelds for that. And it's also especially cool to have a small GameCube or PS2 handheld. This thing has plenty of power for these systems, and the controls on this do work very well. It's kind of a marvel to have something so small that can play through the vast majority of GameCube and PS2 titles. Now when it comes to the higher end stuff, like game streaming and Nintendo Switch, I think it works okay, but the main thing for me is the screen is just too small. It's only 5 inches, and so I find myself squinting with a 5-inch screen. In addition, when it comes to emulating some of the higher end systems, the device does get quite warm even with the fan on, and so that's one of the reasons why I mostly just play PS2 and GameCube on this device in particular. And when it comes to playing more modern games, like twin stick shooter style games, I found that this shape in particular is actually not very good because you don't have any grips on the bottom. This is a very flat device. And so it's kind of like how it was with the PS Vita in that you just don't have anything to grab onto here on the bottom. So when you start to use these shoulders and triggers, it makes everything just kind of feel a little bit top heavy. For those types of games, I would recommend looking into a 3D printed grip. You can usually get these for around $30 on Etsy, and there's a variety of different ones out there. I've been using this one. I'll leave it linked down below. Now, the way this works is you just basically pop the device in and voila, you've got like full grips right here. And so all those problems before where you didn't have anything to hold on to just magically go away, but it does make the device quite a bit bigger. It kind of takes away from the whole mini thing. At that point, you've got a device that's about the same size as the Odin 2 in terms of just overall volume, but it has a smaller screen. And so I would say that between the two, I'd rather play on the Odin 2. But this is a nice alternative if you already have the Odin 2 Mini and you want to play some more modern games and make them more comfortable. A $30 fix like this is pretty great. One other nitpick I have about this device is the start and select placement are down here, and I find that to be just a little bit less comfortable than the other two devices, which have them up here by the top of the screen like on the Nintendo Switch. And so this is something that has annoyed me about this device over time. It's just that I have to reach down here to press select and start. And to be fair, that's the same placement as the PS Vita, so I think they were just trying to honor that design, but still, yeah, it's a little bit annoying. Now, in terms of ergonomics, I think that the original Odin 2 is a pretty good compromise and middle ground. This one does have an ergonomic grip on the back. In fact, it's actually quite big, and so I find this to work well in a variety of different use cases. For example, I can play retro games on it, or something like GameCube with a single analog stick, but then also I can play more modern games, even with these shoulders and triggers. My main complaint about the ergonomics on this have to do with the D-pad and the right analog stick, which again, I wish they were a little bit more inboard. That would make them easier to reach. So I think among the three devices, when it comes to D-pad-centric gaming, this one is probably the worst of the bunch, but still not terrible. In general, I would say this one probably has the widest range and ergonomic comfort without having to resort to an external grip. Now, the Odin 2 Portal is a very roomy device. It's a lot larger, so I have a lot of access right here. So it's very comfortable to be able to use it with a D-pad or analog sticks and even more modern games. My only complaint here has to do with those shallow grips and the fact that it feels relatively flat. Now, thankfully, AYN recognized this as well, and they actually offer this grip right here. I think it's under $20, and this is a TPU rubber grip, but it fits right into the Odin 2 Portal and completely transforms these ergonomics because it gives it a full-size grip. And so personally, I just put this grip on my Odin 2 Portal at all times, and I never take it off, and I love it. And the thing is that I don't really mind having a grip on this device because this is a large device, so I already expect it to be large. And so adding a grip to this is not a big deal for me compared to like the Odin 2 Mini, where one of its selling points is the fact that it's so small. So in this case, yeah, I put the grip on my Odin 2 Portal and all of my ergonomic complaints just vanish away. And so this is a very comfortable handheld to use, but I would put that caveat on there that I do think it needs the grip, at least for me. In particular, I think this handheld is very comfortable when it comes to analog stick and trigger gameplay, so I love using this for game streaming. Now let's talk about the screen, and these all three are very different. So we've got different sizes, 5, 6, 7 inches, but then also mini LED, LCD, and then AMOLED. These two have a 60 Hz refresh rate, while this one is 120, and they also have varying degrees of brightness and dimness. The Odin 2 Mini gets up to 1100 nits brightness, whereas the Odin 2 Portal gets up to 800, and I'm not really sure what the Odin 2 is. They actually don't show it in their spec sheet, but I would guess it's somewhere around like 500 instead. And here's what they look like at max brightness. So you can see that, yeah, the mini LED on the Odin 2 Mini is just like so bright, like it's washing out everything. And then also the Odin 2 Portal is very bright too, definitely too bright, whereas the Odin 2 is still bright, but not compared to the other two. And here we are at minimum brightness, and you can see that both the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Portal are so dark that you can barely see them, whereas the Odin 2 Mini is a little bit brighter. So among the three, I would say that, yeah, these two are going to be better for playing in a pitch black environment. In fact, turning off the studio lights here, you can see that, yeah, these two are about the same. I would say that maybe the Odin 2 is a little bit brighter, but yes, they are very dim, whereas the Odin 2 Mini is not quite there. I still think they're all pretty good to be able to play in the dark, but yeah, the Odin 2 Mini is definitely going to be brighter among them. Now, when it comes to playing outdoors, the Odin 2 Mini definitely does get brighter than the other two, but I don't think it looks as good in a sunny environment. I think part of it has to do with the fact that the mini LED blacks are not super dark compared to the other two, and so I found that just in general, the screen looks a little bit washed out. Now, in terms of brightness, the Odin 2 definitely is not as bright as the other two, but I still think it's bright enough to be able to play outdoors. Maybe not in direct sunlight the entire time, but it still gets pretty bright. Among the three, if I was to play outside, I would pick the Odin 2 Portal every single time. This thing is both bright, but then also looks very good as well. And so not only can I see the screen very easily, even in direct sunlight, but also the colors come through as well. And so yes, this is probably the best experience among the three when playing outdoors. Let's do a couple comparisons with Stardew Valley. So first, I want to talk about the vignetting that you can find on the Odin 2 Mini. And this is pretty common with mini LED screens where you will have a darker image around the edges of the screen. And you can see it here in this example. There's like a black line along the left right here with Stardew Valley, which you're not seeing on the LCD panel as well as the OLED one. And so this amount of vignetting may or may not bother you. It kind of gives a cinematic feel to everything, but if you're looking for something that looks a little bit more clear and even, then these two screens are definitely better in that regard. Another thing worth noting between these three screens is that in order to get a somewhat even brightness here, just in like a standard indoor environment, it is using different brightness levels. We'll start with the Odin 2 Portal, which I think probably looks the best among the three, and this one is using about a 40%, maybe 45% overall brightness. And that's about right when I'm playing this device. It's usually somewhere between like 30 and 50% brightness, no matter where I am. Now the Odin 2 has a max average brightness a little bit brighter. So you can see I have to go up here to like 75, 80% brightness to match the 45% or so here with the Odin 2 Portal. Now the Odin 2 Mini is kind of all over the place. You might be surprised at how bright this one is right here. It's at about like 20% brightness. But the crazy thing is that there never really seems to be the perfect brightness when using the screen. For example, if we go any further up, it will start to get super washed out. Like look at how bad the colors are. You can barely see the colors once you get too bright. Meanwhile, if you start going below that, it gets really dim and still the colors are not very good either. And so it's hard to find a good match between these in terms of the amount of brightness, but then also getting a nice amount of color. You can see that still, even here, the brightness is about the same between the two, maybe a little bit too bright, but the colors are not there either. It's totally washed out. So when it comes to the practical use of these screens, I find that the Odin 2 Portal is probably the best among them. I mean, the fact that it has a pretty even grade between dimness and brightness, and then the Odin 2 is still pretty good, but requires a higher grade to actually get to something normal, and then the Odin 2 Mini is just kind of all over the place. So yes, in a nutshell, I think that the Mini LED is a little bit too washed out and the colors don't really make sense to me. The Odin 2 is comparatively dull compared to the other two, but I don't really mind that when I'm playing it on its own. And then the Odin 2 Portal is definitely the best screen of the bunch. One final thing worth noting about the Odin 2 Portal that I mentioned in my reviews is that this device will have a little bit of like a green hue when you get down to the lower brightnesses, and it's really hard to see, but something I demonstrated in my review video. And to be honest, since actually making that video, I've never once noticed that problem since then. This might be something that bothers other people when they see a green tint at the lower brightness levels, but for me personally, it's not even something that's risen to my own attention over the past like 4 or 5 months of owning this device. Okay, now let's do an audio test. We're going to talk about the speakers and how the buttons sound, as well as the fan noise. When it comes to the audio itself, I found that I preferred the Odin 2 audio profile, and then I also think that the Odin 2 Mini is surprisingly the loudest of the three, and then the Odin 2 Portal is both the quietest and also a little bit more muffled than I would like. Let me give you a quick demo between the three so you can hear what I'm talking about. In general, I would say the audio is okay and acceptable on all three, but only on the Odin 2 do I find it to be particularly good. Another thing we're talking about is the sound of the face buttons, and on the Odin 2 Portal in particular, I think that they are too loud. The Odin 2 Mini has the quietest of the buttons, then the Odin 2 is a little bit louder, but still something I would consider to be quiet, and then unfortunately I would say the Odin 2 Portal is kind of loud and clacky. In fact, the clacky buttons on the Odin 2 Portal remains my only main complaint about this device. Now that I have this grip to kind of improve the ergonomics, the only thing that bothers me now is the fact that these buttons are loud. And then finally, let's talk about fan noise, and this is kind of surprising as well. So basically with the Odin 2 and Odin 2 Portal, the fan noise is negligible. Like I often do not even hear it going even in sport mode. Meanwhile, you can definitely hear it on the Odin 2 Mini. Now, the reason why this matters is because the Odin 2 Mini, unlike the other two, actually does get warm when you use it. The other two, I've never actually really felt them get warm, but this one I feel it very often, especially when playing like high-end games like Nintendo Switch games, or even GameCube and PS2, especially if you're going to use higher brightness levels. So this is a device that will get uncomfortably warm. Even when you turn on the fan, you can still feel it. So it does come together in a bit of a predicament in that if you want to play the higher end stuff, you'll probably have to turn on the fan, which is going to make the device louder and noisier. And if that's something that bothers you, then this may not be a very good fit, because you can't have it all. You can't have something that's quiet and cool and also plays hard to run systems. So if you are susceptible to things like heat transfer from the device over to your hands like I am, then yes, this may not be something that you particularly enjoy. Okay, now let's talk about performance and battery life. Now, I'm not going to go too much in the details about performance because it's well documented with these chipsets, including in my own videos, but they essentially can perform the same way. So running the Wildlife Extreme Stress Test, the score here is about 3750 for all three. In addition, these devices all have really good stability, 99.8%, 99.6%, 98% over this 20-minute test. So that means that you're not going to see thermal throttling. This is all doing its job. All three of these tests were done at 50% brightness with the high performance mode turned on, and then also the sport fan, which is the highest setting. And what this means from a practical perspective is you'll be able to play just about anything you can on Android on these devices. So that means high-end emulation, things like Wii U and Switch and GameCube and PS2. Your limitation there will mostly just be compatibility with the emulator. And because these devices all are Snapdragon based, that means they have Adreno GPUs, which means you can load custom GPU drivers for those higher end systems, which means that yes, you will get very good performance. You can also run Windows games through things like WinLater as well, and so you've got a lot of options when it comes to performance here. However, when it comes to battery life and temperature, there is a difference between the three, and unfortunately the Odin 2 Mini does get the short end of the stick. The internal temperatures on these two were 37 and 35 degrees Celsius respectively over this 20-minute test, whereas the Odin 2 Mini was 50 degrees Celsius. Now, all those are still within a range, which I would consider to be acceptable, but this one is definitely running hotter. The battery life between the three is not the same either, especially with the Odin 2 Mini, which has that smaller 5000 mAh battery. Over the 20-minute period, the Odin 2 Portal lost 6% battery, whereas the Odin 2 lost 10%. Meanwhile, the Odin 2 Mini lost 17% battery. And so if we do the math between the three of pushing them to its fullest extent, that means the Odin 2 Portal would give me about 5.5 hours of battery life with these same settings. The Odin 2 would give me about 3 hours and 20 minutes, whereas the Odin 2 Mini would be just shy of 2 hours, 1 hour and 58 minutes. So we're looking at 2 hours up to 5.5 hours, depending on the device that you're using when pushing it all the way. However, also bear in mind that I only ran this at a 60 Hz refresh rate while doing this test. So if you run it at a 120 Hz, the battery life is going to be a little bit worse. So from a practical perspective, what this means for me is the Odin 2 and Odin 2 Portal can usually play about 6 to 8 hours of battery when it comes to GameCube and PS2. That's pretty crazy. In fact, this chipset is so powerful you don't have to go into high performance mode for most of those games. You can just play them at the standard mode, which will enhance the battery life even further. For the Odin 2 Mini, it's still pretty good, between like 3 and 4 hours of gameplay with PS2 and GameCube. Bear in mind, you usually will have to turn on the fan in order to make it not so warm. And so in general, I say, yeah, about 3 or 4 hours with the Odin 2 Mini, which is still pretty good when it comes to PS2 and GameCube. When it comes to things like retro gaming and streaming, things that are not very power intensive, you can get upwards of 12 hours on all three of these devices, even upwards of like 16 hours with the Odin 2 Portal. So yes, all day battery life when it comes to playing lower end stuff. And then finally, like I mentioned, when pushing it to the max, you can expect somewhere between like 2 to 5 hours of battery life, depending on what you're playing. So that'll be things like WinLater and Nintendo Switch, as well as, benchmark stuff like that. Okay, so putting it all together here are most of the things that we already talked about and some arbitrary scores that I gave, which are totally subjective, but let's walk through each of them. When it comes to performance, I gave these all an S tier because yes, they can play just about everything. There's no real difference in performance between the three. When it comes to controls, I gave the Odin 2 a little bit lower of a control rating just because of that D-pad centric gaming, which I wish was just a little bit better, but overall, I think they're all still very good. When it comes to ergonomics, I think that overall, just the out-of-box comfort, the Odin 2 is probably the best for me all around. The Odin 2 Mini suffers a little bit when it comes to playing more modern games, but that is easily fixed with a grip, but it also is a bit contradictory because I feel like the Odin 2 Mini is something that you want to keep as small as possible. Meanwhile, I would say the Odin 2 Portal is a B out of the box just because of those flat ergonomics does feel a little bit awkward to me, but when you add the official grip from AYN, it probably pushes it up to an A, maybe even an S tier in terms of ergonomics. Now, in terms of heat transfer, we already talked about the fact that the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Portal don't don't really get warm at all, which is kind of amazing, whereas the Odin 2 Mini definitely does get warm when playing it at a higher brightness level or when pushing it to PS2, GameCube, and beyond. Now, in terms of screen, I would give the Odin 2 Portal an S tier because it is amazing. It's got that AMOLED richness and vibrancy, but then also it is super bright as well. And it has a 120Hz refresh rate, which the other two do not. The Odin 2 for me is just pretty good, so I would give it a B just because it does things pretty well, but it could be better if it was AMOLED. And then meanwhile, the Odin 2 Mini, I think, is just kind of a rough display. You know, those mini LEDs really wash out the whole image. In terms of audio, I think the Odin 2 Mini and the Odin 2 Portal are okay. You know, the Odin 2 Mini gets very loud, but other than that, there's no real defining characteristics to it, and the Odin 2 Portal is a little bit more muffled than I would like. Meanwhile, the original Odin 2 sounds great to me, and so I'm giving that one an A. Now, as far as pocketability, among the three, the Odin 2 Mini is definitely S tier. It's a little bit big for many pockets, but I still think that it's kind of amazing that we have so much power inside of something so small. Meanwhile, the Odin 2 will probably only fit in the front pocket of a hoodie, and then the Odin 2 Portal I would not consider to be pocketable at all. When it comes to fan noise, I think that they are excellent on the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Portal to the point where I rarely even notice that they're on, even in sport mode. I would consider the Odin 2 Mini fan noise to be significant in the fact that it is something that I notice when it is on all the way. In terms of battery life, I think they all three are very impressive for what they do and the size of the device. And so the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Portal are just amazing. I've never gotten to a point where I'm like, oh, I need to plug this in and charge it because the battery has gone down so fast. It's usually one of those things that I just charge every once in a while. The Odin 2 Mini does drain faster, and so that's something I have to be a little bit more conscious about, but I still think it's good battery life for the size of the handheld. One thing I didn't mention in a specific section is the fact that these all three have video out via USB-C, but the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Mini also have micro HDMI, so you have multiple HDMI out functions. And the video out options for each of these devices is excellent because we can actually choose the resolution and the refresh rate for each of them, and so I think that's really awesome. So video output on these devices is amazing if you want to consoleize them. I gave the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Mini a slightly higher score just because they have multiple options, micro HDMI as well as USB-C video out. And then finally, the last category here is super subjective. This is the fun factor. So this is essentially how much fun I have when playing these devices. When it comes to the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Portal, I put them both at an S tier because every time I play these devices, I think to myself, these are like the best handhelds ever made. And so I really enjoy playing them. And so yeah, I gave them an S tier. Now the Odin 2 Mini is still a very excellent device, but not quite there for me. You know, it gets warm while you're playing it, and then the screen is not the best. You've got the vignetting and the washed out colors and whatnot. And so those are factors that I see while I'm playing the game. And so it's not quite there at S tier. It's a very impressive handheld, but not quite there for me. Now, if we assign the same numbers to each of these categories and then rank them accordingly, the Odin 2 actually comes out just slightly ahead of the Odin 2 Portal, and then the Odin 2 Mini is definitely in third place. However, numbers do not tell the whole story, and so I think that it is worth noting the screen in particular. I gave it an S tier on the Portal, but a B on the Odin 2. And there's a big difference between the two, probably more than 2 whole points. And so I wanted to make that known that yes, if you are big on screens like me, that S tier on the Odin 2 Portal might be like an SS tier because it is so good. And then of course from a numbers perspective, bear in mind that I gave the ergonomics a B, but that's without the grip. With the grip, I would give it an A or even an S tier, which would push it over the Odin 2. So long story short, yes, the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Portal are about neck and neck in this whole comparison video. In the end, when it comes to the Odin 2 Mini, I have found myself preferring my Retroid Pocket 5 over the other. They're about the same size, but this one has a 5.5-inch screen, which is AMOLED, and it looks so much better than the Mini LED on the Odin 2 Portal. If we could get this screen in the Odin 2 Mini with this amount of performance and with this button layout, I would definitely prefer the Odin 2 Mini, but as it stands, this is the one I ended up playing more often. And also don't forget the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. This thing has the same processor and screen as the Retroid Pocket 5, but it actually has some very unique ergonomics. I talk about it in my videos for this as well. And so between these two right here, I prefer playing them over the Odin 2 Mini. So it really comes down to what you plan on playing. You know, these are not going to be as good when it comes to high-end stuff like Switch and Win Later, but they still do a pretty good job, whereas this is going to be better in those respects. But if you are just really looking for something to play Nintendo Wii and GameCube and PS2, then I think that these two devices are good enough, and I definitely prefer this screen. And as a bonus, you can save yourself $100 along the way. Now, when it comes to the Odin 2 versus the Odin 2 Portal, I still haven't made up my mind. I am going back and forth between these two all the time. My personal favorite has always been the Odin 2, but the Odin 2 Portal lately has been winning me over with the larger screen, the AMOLED display, and the 120Hz refresh rate. When it comes to emulating stuff, like Nintendo Switch and Winlator and whatnot, I think they're about the same, but when it comes to game streaming, I would definitely pick the Odin 2 Portal. This thing has that bigger display, it's also AMOLED, and then that 120Hz refresh rate can be used when streaming as well. And so even streaming from the cloud or just locally with your own PC, this is probably the better choice. The way I've been thinking about it is if I had to pick one of these two devices and I didn't own either of them and I was going to buy one, which one would I get? I'm still very torn, but I think I would end up picking up the Odin 2 just because I like the smaller form factor of it. And, it's just naturally more ergonomic and a little bit more travel friendly because it doesn't have the grip that I need to add to it. And then I think it's just good enough for me. Most of the time I spend my time, emulating, playing PS2, GameCube, Nintendo Switch, and this has always been a really good fit for that. But if streaming is your priority or you want an AMOLED display and something a little bit bigger, then yes, the Odin 2 Portal is still a very excellent buy. It almost feels like as a parent, I'm having to choose my favorite child, which you're never supposed to do. But at the end of the day, I can see the weaknesses as well as the benefits of each of them. And so I can see this going either way. But for me personally, I think I'm going to go with the Odin 2. I wish this had an OLED display and, a couple other nitpicks about it. But man, I've been using this for a year and a half and I love it every day. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Among these three Odin 2 devices, which one is your favorite and why? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.